January 17, 1944. 29,000 feet above the frozen fields of Brunswick, Germany. The air was thin and cold enough to crack bone. Ice crystals formed on cockpit glass, and the sun, pale and distant, cast long shadows across a formation of B-17 flying fortresses droning eastward through hostile sky. Below, the snow-covered German countryside stretched like a wrinkled map, villages reduced to black dots against endless white. The bomber crews could feel it in their chest, the tightness, the waiting. They were deep in enemy territory now, and the Luftwaffe was coming. Among the escort fighters weaving above the bombers flew a single P-47 Thunderbolt, tail number 2106-827, piloted by a 23-year-old farm boy from Ferndale, Washington named Robert S. Johnson. He had pale blue eyes, a jawline carved from Depression-era hardship, and hands that once milked cows now gripped a control stick in the center of 7 tons of American machinery. Johnson was already an ace. 7 confirmed kills painted in neat rows beneath his canopy. But on this frozen morning, he would do something no Luftwaffe pilot could comprehend, something that would be dissected in German debriefings for months afterward, whispered about in Bavarian beer halls, and ultimately dismissed as impossible. He would survive what should have been certain death, and in doing so, destroy the myth of German aerial invincibility through sheer, incomprehensible endurance. The German fighter pilots who rose to meet the American formation that day were among the most experienced in the world. Men like Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler and his comrades had cut their teeth over the Channel, over North Africa, over the endless Russian steppe. They had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes, Yaks and Lajijis. They knew the ballet of aerial combat, the geometry of deflection shooting, the physics of the high-speed stall, the exact moment when a pilot's nerve would break and he would try to run. They climbed through the clouds with the confidence of predators who had never encountered prey they couldn't kill. Their Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s were masterpieces of engineering, sleek, fast, deadly. They expected the Americans to scatter, to jettison their bombs and dive for home the moment the first tracers stitched across the sky. What they encountered instead was something that violated every principle in the Luftwaffe's tactical manual. The attack began conventionally enough. A swarm of 4 FW-190s rolled in from the bomber's 6 o'clock high, the standard approach, cannon and machine gun already hammering. Johnson saw them coming. Every fighter pilot's nightmare, bandits with altitude and speed advantage, and broke hard left to intercept. His wingman, a nervous lieutenant on his 3rd mission, broke the wrong direction and disappeared into the scrum. Johnson was alone now, the way he preferred it. He pushed the Thunderbolt's nose down, building speed, and met the lead 190 head-on in a closing speed of over 700 miles per hour. Both pilots fired. Both missed. They flashed past each other with inches to spare. Then the second 190 caught him. The burst came from Johnson's 4 o'clock, a line of tracer fire that seemed to move in slow motion, orange pearls arcing through space. He felt the impacts before he heard them, heavy, metallic thumps as 20mm cannon shells punched through the Thunderbolt's aluminum skin. His right wing erupted in jagged holes. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canopy, freezing instantly in the negative 40-degree air. The stick went stiff in his hands. Johnson hauled back on it anyway, pulling into a climbing turn that should have torn the wings off, but the Thunderbolt held together. It always held together. That was the genius of Republic Aviation's design. A radial engine as big as a Volkswagen, wrapped in armor plate, bolted to an airframe built like a bridge. German pilots called it Die Jug, the Jug, with grudging respect. You could shoot a Thunderbolt to pieces, and it would keep flying. Johnson needed every ounce of that durability now. The Focke-Wulfs swarmed him. 3, then 4, then 6 gray shapes orbiting like wolves around a wounded elk. They took turns making firing passes, disciplined and methodical, conserving ammunition, waiting for the American to make the fatal mistake. Try to run, or freeze up, or simply run out of sky. Johnson did none of these things. Instead, he began to fly in a pattern that made no sense. He skidded, he fishtailed, he flew the Thunderbolt like a drunk driver on a mountain road, nose high, then low, yawing left and right in random, unpredictable lurches. His airspeed bled off to nothing, then surged back as he pointed the nose down and firewalled the throttle. He climbed until the big Pratt & Whitney engine choked and coughed, then dove until the airframe shuddered on the edge of compressibility. He spun the aircraft on its vertical axis, presenting his armored belly to attackers, then snapped it level and accelerated in the opposite direction. There was no pattern, no rhythm, no predictability. It was chaos with a purpose. The German pilots couldn't get a clean shot. Every principle of aerial gunnery depends on predicting your target's future position, leading the target as duck hunters do. But Johnson gave them nothing to predict. One moment he was climbing, the next falling, the next skidding sideways in a maneuver that should have stalled the aircraft but somehow didn't. The Luftwaffe pilots burned through their ammunition in frustration, tracers chasing the Thunderbolt's tail, but always arriving a fraction of a second too late, punching empty air. They radioed each other in confusion. Was the American hit? Was his aircraft damaged? Why didn't he just die? Johnson's canopy was gone now, blown away by a 20mm shell. The wind screamed through the cockpit at 200 miles per hour. His instruments were shot to pieces. Altimeter frozen, airspeed indicator dead, compass spinning uselessly. Blood from a scalp wound ran into his eyes. His left arm hung numb and useless where shrapnel had torn through the muscle. But his right hand still gripped the stick, and his right foot still worked the rudder pedals, and his brain, running on adrenaline and pure survival instinct, kept calculating angles and distances and the one equation that mattered. Stay alive for 10 more seconds, then 10 more after that. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. 23 minutes of continuous combat at altitudes ranging from 28,000 feet down to the deck, across 30 miles of German countryside. By the time Johnson finally broke contact and limped westward toward the Channel, 17 Luftwaffe fighters had taken at least one pass at him. He had been hit 201 times. His aircraft looked like it had been attacked with a sledgehammer, wings shredded, tail riddled with holes, fuselage torn open in a dozen places, oil and hydraulic fluid and fuel leaking from wounds that should have been fatal. The propeller was bent. The gun bays were empty. He'd fired every round trying to keep the Germans honest. And yet the Pratt & Whitney still turned. The wings still generated lift, and Robert Johnson still breathed. He crash-landed at the first British airfield he could find, a grass strip on the coast, the Thunderbolt skidding to a halt with both tires blown and the landing gear half collapsed. When the British ground crew pulled him out of the cockpit, they counted the holes and stood in silence. The intelligence officer who debriefed him wrote in the mission report, "Pilot states aircraft was drunk pattern due to control damage. Miraculous survival." The report was forwarded to 8 Fighter Command, then to the Pentagon, where engineers studied it and shook their heads in wonder. But the real story was being written in Germany. The Luftwaffe pilots who had engaged Johnson landed at their bases confused and angry. They had followed correct doctrine. They had executed textbook attacks. They had scored hits, many hits, and still the American had escaped. In the debriefing rooms, flight leaders questioned their men sharply. Had they aimed correctly? Had they closed to effective range? Were they certain of their ammunition loads? The pilots insisted they had done everything right. The problem was the target. It had flown like a madman, like someone with no regard for the laws of physics or self-preservation. "We ein betrunkener," one pilot said, like a drunk. The phrase stuck. In subsequent intelligence summaries, German analysts noted a disturbing trend. American pilots, particularly Thunderbolt pilots, were surviving attacks that should have been lethal by flying in erratic, undisciplined patterns inconsistent with accepted fighter tactics. What the Germans didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, because it contradicted their entire philosophy of air combat, was that Johnson's drunk flying wasn't panic or desperation. It was innovation born from abundance. The Luftwaffe trained its pilots to fly with Prussian precision, to execute maneuvers from the manual, to conserve ammunition and fuel, because both were scarce. They flew beautiful, deadly, efficient patterns, because that's what you did when every bullet mattered and every gallon of fuel was rationed. German pilot training, once legendary for its thoroughness, had been cut from 2 years to 6 months by 1944. New pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 100 hours of flight time, clutching doctrine manuals like religious texts, because that was all they had. They had been taught that aerial combat was a science, angles and speeds and probabilities, and that survival came from perfect execution. But Robert Johnson had been trained at American flight schools, where aviation gasoline flowed like water, where pilots burned thousands of gallons learning to handle an aircraft at the edge of its envelope, where instructors encouraged students to experiment, to push limits, to discover what the machine could do beyond what the manual said. Johnson had 300 hours in the Thunderbolt before he ever saw combat. He had spent entire afternoons deliberately stalling the aircraft, spinning it, recovering it, learning its quirks and forgiveness. He knew the Thunderbolt could take punishment because he'd read reports of other pilots who had brought them home on a prayer and spare parts. He knew the big radial engine would keep running because American engines were over-engineered, built with tolerances that allowed for battle damage. He knew he could throw the aircraft into maneuvers that would rip apart a 109 because Republic had built the Thunderbolt for a 230-pound pilot in full gear, pulling maximum Gs in a panic turn, not for a 160-pound pilot flying by the numbers. In short, Johnson survived because he could afford to be wasteful. Wasteful with fuel, with altitude, with ammunition, with the structural limits of his aircraft. The Thunderbolt was built to be abused. American industry would build another if this one broke. In 1944 alone, Republic Aviation produced 4,186 P-47 Thunderbolts. That's 11 aircraft per day, every single day, rolling off assembly lines in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. If Johnson's plane had gone down, another would have replaced it within hours. The Germans, by contrast, were producing fighters in caves and dispersed factories, hiding from Allied bombers, scrounging for aluminum and chromium and rubber. Every Focke-Wulf that took off was precious, irreplaceable. That philosophy, that abundance-driven approach to warfare, was incomprehensible to Germans who had grown up in a nation where everything was rationed, where efficiency was survival, where a wasted bullet could mean the difference between victory and defeat. To fly drunk, to waste fuel in random maneuvers, to fire all your ammunition in a single engagement, these were sins against the Germanic ideal of controlled, measured, efficient violence. But to the Americans, it was just Tuesday. Over the following months, the pattern repeated. American fighter pilots, particularly the Thunderbolt and Mustang jockeys, developed a reputation for surviving impossible odds through sheer unpredictability. They would skid, they would snap roll, they would dive at speeds that should have torn their aircraft apart, and they would come home. The Luftwaffe's kill rates began to decline, not because German pilots lost skill, but because American pilots stopped playing by rules that favored the Germans. They invented new rules, chaotic rules, rules written in hydraulic fluid and high-octane gasoline, and thousands of hours of training time that most Luftwaffe pilots, rushed through shortened courses as the war turned against Germany, simply didn't have. The contrast became symbolic of something larger. The Germans had entered the war with the world's most advanced aircraft, the most experienced pilots, the most sophisticated tactics. They had the Bf-109, which had dominated the skies over Spain and Poland and France. They had pilots who were veterans before the first American fighter crossed the Atlantic, but they were fighting a war of scarcity, limited fuel from Romanian oil fields vulnerable to bombing, limited pilots because training took resources they didn't have, limited aircraft because every factory was a target. The Americans, by contrast, were fighting a war of plenty. They had fuel from Texas wells that could supply the world twice over. They had pilots trained at dozens of bases across a continent no enemy bomber could touch. They had factories in Detroit and Seattle and Los Angeles pumping out aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Robert Johnson became the embodiment of that truth. After the Brunswick mission, he flew 61 more combat sorties. He survived being shot down twice more, once over the Channel, where a British destroyer fished him out of the water, once over France, where he evaded capture and walked back to Allied lines through the resistance network. He shot down 20 more German aircraft, bringing his final tally to 27 confirmed kills. But more importantly, he survived. He came home, and every time he landed that battered Thunderbolt, every time he walked away from an aircraft that should have been his coffin, he proved that American abundance was more powerful than German precision. Years after the war, a German pilot who had been in the Brunswick engagement was interviewed by a military historian. He described the encounter in careful detail, still puzzled after decades. "We hit him," the German said. "We hit him many times. He should have gone down. But he kept flying, like he didn't know he was supposed to die, like the rules didn't apply to him." The historian asked if the German thought Johnson had been a great pilot. The old man thought for a long time before answering. "He was not elegant," he finally said. "He was not classical, but he was free to fly badly, to waste fuel, to break his airplane, because he knew there would be another one. We never had that freedom. That was the difference." That difference, the freedom to be wasteful, to experiment, to survive through abundance rather than precision, was stamped into every rivet of every aircraft that rolled off American production lines. It was baked into the training programs that gave pilots hundreds of hours in the cockpit before they saw combat. It was embedded in the supply chains that kept fighters fueled and armed and repaired no matter how far from home they flew. And it was carried in the hearts of young men like Robert Johnson, who grew up in a country that taught them the sky had no limits and that rules were meant to be rewritten. The Thunderbolt Johnson flew that day. Tail number 2106-827 was repaired and returned to service. It flew 43 more missions before being retired and eventually scrapped for aluminum in 1946. But the lesson it taught, that American pilots could win not by being better tacticians, but by being impossible to kill, echoed through every air battle for the rest of the war. The Germans shot down thousands of American aircraft. They claimed victory after victory in the daily communiques. But they could never shoot down enough. For every Thunderbolt they destroyed, 5 more appeared. For every pilot they killed, 10 more arrived with more training and more fuel and more ammunition than the mission strictly required, because abundance was the American doctrine, and waste was a weapon in itself. In the end, the Germans lost not because their pilots lacked courage or skill, but because they faced an enemy who could afford to fly drunk, who could afford to be reckless and wasteful and tactically imperfect, because behind every pilot stood the full industrial might of a continent that had never known strategic bombing, never known shortage, never known the fear that the next bullet might be the last one available. The Luftwaffe fought with desperate efficiency. The Americans fought with careless abundance. And in that contrast lay the entire story of the war. One side counting bullets, the other side forgetting to count it all. The sky above Brunswick is quiet now. Commercial jets trace contrails across the same airspace where Robert Johnson fought for his life. But somewhere in that cold blue, in the space between clouds, the echo of a Pratt & Whitney radial engine still thunders, drunk on freedom, impossible to kill, carrying a truth the Germans learned too late, that abundance, not elegance, wins wars, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who doesn't know he's supposed to lose.